Our story begins with Abraham, the ancestral father of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Everything we know about Abraham comes from religious scripture, either the Bible or the Quran. There is no historical evidence outside of religious scripture that Abraham existed. Therefore, no one can say that the Islamic narrative is untrue since there is no objective evidence otherwise. The Bible and the Quran agree on much of the story surrounding Abraham and his progeny. However, there are some key differences. According to the Bible, Abraham, or Ibrahim in Arabic, was born in the land of Ur of the Chaldees in modern-day Iraq. Ibrahim's father was named Terach and was born 9 generations after the great flood of Noah. Terach had 2 other sons besides Ibrahim named Nahor and Haran. Haran had a son named Lot. When Ibrahim became an adult, he married a woman named Sarah. Most of the people in Ibrahim's tribe and his family worshipped wooden or stone idols. Ibrahim alayhi salam often debated with them on the absurdity of worshipping these idols that they had created with their own hands. Ibrahim alayhi salam was not afraid to use logic and reasoning with his people. He pointed out various celestial bodies like a star, the moon, and the sun, mockingly suggesting each could be his Lord. Then he used their inevitable disappearance as proof they could not be God. On another occasion, he destroyed all the idols in a temple except the largest one. When his people asked what happened, Ibrahim pointed to the largest idol and told them to ask that one. His people scoffed and said that he knew the idol could not speak. Ibrahim alayhi salam then asked how could they worship something that could neither hurt nor benefit them. Ibrahim was especially upset that his father continued to worship idols. Despite his love for his father, Ibrahim continued to challenge his beliefs. Finally, Ibrahim's people were fed up with him and decided to kill him. They tried burning him alive, but according to the Quran, Allah miraculously saved him. After that experience, Ibrahim alayhi salam decided to leave his people. They were not going to change their ways, and they had already tried to kill him once. Besides, the land was going through a famine, and he hoped to find a better situation elsewhere. Ibrahim left with his wife and his nephew Lot and headed east towards Egypt, which had the bountiful Nile River Valley. As they traveled through the land of Canaan and modern-day Palestine, Ibrahim's nephew Lot decided to part ways. Lot, or Lut in Arabic, headed west towards the towns of Sodom and Gomorrah, where he'd learned the people there were involved in multiple sins. Ibrahim alayhi salam and Sarah continued to Egypt, which had recently reunified after a period of internal strife. This was Egypt's Middle Kingdom period. Egypt was divided into provinces ruled by powerful families. The chief of one of these families used to kidnap foreign women who entered his territory, often killing their husbands in the process. When he learned of this, Ibrahim alayhi salam pretended to be Sarah's brother instead of her husband. One of the Egyptian chiefs did indeed kidnap Sarah, but when he attempted to violate her, Allah protected her. Humiliated, the chief gave Sarah a handmaiden named Hajar and dismissed them all from his land. Ibrahim left Egypt, now with Sarah and Hajar, but still without a child. Knowing her husband wanted a son, Sarah suggested he take Hajar as his wife. Ibrahim's first child, Ismael alayhi salam, was born from this union. Jealousy and rivalry grew between Sarah and Hajar. Allah instructed Ibrahim alayhi salam to take Hajar and Ismael, who was still a baby, deeper into Arabia. Ibrahim left Sarah behind while he, Hajar, and Ismael continued down the Arabian coast. They finally stopped at a barren valley the locals called Mecca, about 700 miles from Canaan. Assuming the average person can walk about 10 miles a day, they would have been traveling for about 2 months. Assuring Hajar that this was all part of Allah's plan, Ibrahim left her with a few provisions and headed back north to Sarah. We will continue the story of Hajar and Ismael later on. 12.5 years later, Sarah gave birth to a son named Isaac, or Ishaq in Arabic. This brings up one of the differences between the biblical narrative and the Islamic tradition. In the Old Testament, Ismael and Ishaq grew up close to Ibrahim. Hajar was not sent away until Sarah became concerned about which son would inherit from Ibrahim alayhi salam. However, in the Islamic tradition, Hajar left while Ismael was still a baby years before Ishaq was born. There is no indication in the Quran the two brothers ever met. When he was 8 days old, Ishaq alayhi salam was circumcised just like his father and brother had been many years before. Perhaps the most famous story concerning Ishaq is Allah's order for his sacrifice. According to the Torah, when Ishaq was still a boy, Allah ordered Ibrahim alayhi salam to sacrifice him as a test of his obedience. Ibrahim obediently took his son and was prepared to kill him when Allah stopped him, informed him it was just a test, and provided a ram for sacrifice instead. A similar story exists in the Quranic narrative but doesn't specify whether the son was Ishaq or Ismael. However, Muslims have traditionally held that the son to be sacrificed was Ismael rather than Ishaq. When Ishaq was 40 years old, he married a woman named Rebecca who was barren for many years. Ishaq alayhi salam prayed to Allah for a child and was blessed with twins, Jacob and Esau. In the biblical narrative, Ishaq favored Esau while Rebecca favored Jacob. Being a few minutes older than his brother, Esau was to inherit all of Ishaq's lands. But Jacob, or Yaqub in Arabic, tricked him out of his birthright and the brothers became enemies. Yaqub alayhi salam, also called Israel, married his cousin Rachel, her older sister Leah, and their slaves Bilhah and Zilpah, at least according to the Torah. Yaqub had 12 sons from these 4 women. These sons would become the fathers of the 12 tribes of Israel. That's where we get the phrase Bani Israel, or the children of Israel. Rachel was Yaqub's favorite, and she bore him his 2 favorite sons, Joseph and Benjamin. Yaqub's love for his 2 youngest sons made his 10 older sons jealous. They plotted together, told their father Joseph, or Yusuf in Arabic, had been killed by a wild animal and sold their brother into slavery. Yusuf wound up a slave in Egypt, which by this time was under Hyksos domination. The Hyksos were not Egyptian and may have come from parts of Western Asia. In any case, Yusuf saved the kingdom from a disastrous famine using his gift of dream interpretation. For his services, the Hyksos king rewarded Yusuf alayhi salam with a high position in government. However, other areas in the region were not spared the ravages of the famine, and it was not long before Yusuf's brother came to Egypt looking for food. Yusuf forgave his brothers for their previous deception and invited them and their families, including their father Yaqub, to relocate to Egypt. Bani Israel, the children of Israel, Hebrews, and Israelites all referred to the same group of people. These are the people who descended from Prophet Yaqub alayhi salam. Bani Israel flourished under Hyksos-dominated Egypt and enjoyed an elevated status based on Yusuf's close relationship with the Hyksos king. But 100 years later, all of that changed. The Egyptians revolted against their foreign overlords and drove the Hyksos out. The re-established Egyptian monarchy now viewed Bani Israel as collaborators with their former foreign oppressors. As punishment, Bani Israel was enslaved by the Egyptians for 200 years. Despite their enslavement, the Hebrews continued to multiply. To stem their numbers, and as a form of humiliation, the Egyptian government passed a law declaring all newborn Israelite boys were to be killed immediately upon birth. Within this era of despair, Moses, or Musa in Arabic, was born to the tribe of Levi. Allah inspired Musa's mother to place him in a basket and set him in the Nile River to escape Egyptian law. Ultimately, baby Musa was discovered by a member of the royal household, taken in, and raised as an Egyptian prince. Musa alayhi salam witnessed his people's despair in Egypt as a young man. When he saw an Egyptian official beating a Hebrew slave, he struck the official, immediately killing him. Musa was now a wanted man and fled Egypt for the wilderness of the Sinai Peninsula. He was taken in by an old man living in the area, served him for many years, and eventually married one of his daughters. One day, while walking with his family and animals in Sinai, Musa saw a burning bush. When he went to investigate, Allah began speaking to him from the burning bush. At that moment, Musa learned he was a prophet of Allah. Allah gave him the responsibility of rescuing his people from Egypt's cruelty. With his brother Harun alayhi salam, Musa alayhi salam confronted the Egyptian ruler whose title was Pharaoh or Fir'aun in Arabic. He warned Pharaoh of Allah's wrath and commandment to free Bani Israel. When Pharaoh refused, Allah sent various punishments or plagues on Egypt. This cycle continued for some time, with each punishment increasing in intensity until Allah finally instructed Musa alayhi salam to take his people and leave Egypt. Even though Musa and the Israelites successfully escaped Egyptian slavery, that generation was not prepared to carry out Allah's plan. They had been slaves for too long and could not escape their mental shackles. Hence, they wandered through the wilderness of Arabia and the Levant for another 40 years. By this time, Musa and Harun alayhimussalam had died, and Bani Israel was being led by a man named Joshua from the tribe of Ephraim. Joshua, or Yusha in Arabic, led the Israelites in a successful invasion of the land of Canaan. Canaan, which covers much of modern-day Palestine and Lebanon, was inhabited by various peoples, including the Philistines. After conquering Canaan, Joshua divided the new territory among the descendants of the 12 sons of Yaqub, or Bani Israel. Each tribe ruled their land semi-independently from the others, though they often cooperated in matters of mutual interest. This began the biblical period of Judges, which lasted about 300 years. Even though the Israelites had conquered much of the land, they had not driven out all the people living there. The Israelites were surrounded by enemies with a stronger historical footprint and fell into a devastating cycle. The Israelites would adopt the ways of their enemies, even worshiping their pagan idols. Allah would then send a punishment on the Israelites, usually in the form of an invasion from one of their enemies. The Israelites would repent, and Allah would send a judge, or from the Muslim perspective, a prophet, to deliver them. Sometimes the Israelites would obey this judge, or prophet if you prefer that term, and sometimes they would disobey him and kill him. Either way, the Israelites would eventually fall into sin again, and the cycle would start all over. Samuel, from the tribe of Levi, was the last of these judges, and he emerged at a time when much of the Israelite land had been invaded and occupied by the Philistines. Samuel preached for nearly 20 years before leading a successful revolt that drove the Philistines out. This last invasion was just too much for the Israelites. They decided they needed a king to unite their tribes against their enemies. Samuel ultimately anointed a young man from the tribe of Benjamin named Saul, or Talut in Arabic, as the first king of the Israelites. Though some did not like Samuel's pick, Talut alayhi salam was initially very successful. He led several military campaigns against their enemies, including the Philistines, Amalekites, Moabites, and Ammonites. However, according to the Bible, Saul and Samuel had a falling out where it was prophesied the next king would not come from Saul's line. In the biblical narrative, as criticisms of his rule increased, Saul grew more paranoid. A young shepherd named David, or Dawood in Arabic, was appointed as his musician to help soothe his nerves. But Dawood, who was from the tribe of Judah, also began to make a name for himself on the battlefield. It all began when the Philistines amassed for another invasion, this time bringing their champion, a large man named Goliath. Dawood alayhi salam killed Goliath with a slingshot to the face and rocketed to fame. When Saul and his son Jonathan were killed in battle, David was chosen as king of Judah and eventually over all of Israel. Dawood alayhi salam continued to fight his enemies, expanding its territories and increasing its wealth. This culminated with his successful siege and conquest of the city of Jerusalem. And since Jerusalem was a neutral city that did not belong to any specific Israelite tribe, David chose it as his capital. Prophet Dawood alayhi salam had the Ark of the Covenant containing the ancient tablets Allah had sent down to Musa alayhi salam brought to Jerusalem. He intended to build a temple around the Ark dedicated to Allah's worship. Now this next part of the story comes from the Bible. As Muslims, we do not believe it is true as it has a prophet of Allah committing multiple major sins. As the story goes, before David could build his temple, he fell in love with a married woman named Bathsheba. David impregnated Bathsheba, though it is not clear if the relationship was consensual or not. Then, David had her husband sent to the front lines with the most brutal fighting and no support to cover him. When her husband was killed in battle, David married Bathsheba. Because of this sin, Allah forbade David from building a temple for the Ark of the Covenant. The first child between David and Bathsheba did not live long. However, their second child, Solomon, was born after their marriage and succeeded David as king of Israel. King Solomon, or Suleiman in Arabic, is most famous for his wisdom, his harem, and his wealth. He is said to have ascended the throne at 15 years of age and ruled until he was about 60 years old. During his reign, the kingdom of Israel experienced a golden age, reaching its height in wealth, influence, and territory. As king, Prophet Suleiman alayhi salam initiated several building projects and concluded various trade deals. His most famous building was the Temple of Solomon. The Ark of the Covenant was placed inside the temple, thereby fulfilling his father's wish. According to Jewish tradition, the temple was built atop Mount Moriah, where Ibrahim alayhi salam almost sacrificed his son. King Solomon increased the kingdom's wealth with various trade and export deals. One of his most famous dealings was with Belkis, the Queen of Sheba. Though the details differ, both the biblical and the Quranic narratives confirm that Belkis visited Prophet Suleiman alayhi salam in Jerusalem and became an ally. Whether that was through marriage or diplomatic means is not certain. However, Ethiopian tradition states they did marry and had a son named Menelik. Menelik ascended the throne as king of Sheba and ruled according to Hebrew law. Centuries later, his descendants converted to Christianity. Israel's golden age did not last. Upon Solomon's death, his son Rehoboam became king. However, several tribes refused to accept him and the kingdom split in two. The two kingdoms of Israel and Judah never united again and often fought against each other. Israel and Judah existed as independent kingdoms for another 200 years. In 732 BCE, after being threatened by the kingdom of Israel, the kingdom of Judah appealed to the Assyrian Empire for assistance. The Assyrians invaded Israel, exiling many of its inhabitants and reducing the kingdom to colony status. The kingdom of Judah, however, continued to exist independently for another 200 years. During this period, the children of Israel renewed their cycle of rebellion against Allah. Some even went so far as to sacrifice their children to pagan deities. Several prophets came during this time to warn them of Allah's wrath, including Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. Jeremiah and Ezekiel both lived to see their prophecies of doom come true. 500 miles east of Jerusalem, the Babylonian Empire began expanding westward. When the Babylonians defeated the Assyrians, the Egyptians got involved. Egypt began seizing land in the Levant and Syria as a buffer against Babylon's new king, Nebuchadnezzar II. The tiny kingdom of Judah, now stuck between two giant empires, decided to ally with the Babylonians. The Babylonians attempted to invade Egyptian territory and were severely defeated. The king of Judah took this opportunity to switch allegiance to the Egyptians. This was a big mistake. Nebuchadnezzar consolidated his forces and relaunched his campaign against the Egyptians. He defeated the Egyptians, driving them out of Syria for good. Then he turned his sights on the kingdom of Judah. Nebuchadnezzar laid siege to Jerusalem, which eventually fell in 597 BCE. He deported thousands of Israelites to Babylon, stripped Solomon's temple of its treasures, and installed a puppet king. 12 years later, the puppet king rebelled against Babylon, again allying with the Egyptians. The Babylonians put Jerusalem under siege again, this time for nearly 2 years. When the city fell, Nebuchadnezzar showed no mercy. The city was plundered and razed. Solomon's temple was destroyed. The king of Judah was forced to watch as his sons were killed. Then he was blinded, so that would be the last thing he'd see, and imprisoned in Babylon until he died. Most of the city's inhabitants were carried off to Babylon as captives or slaves. However, many of the survivors fled to Egypt and established a community there. This ended the kingdom of Judah, which became a province of the Babylonian Empire. The former inhabitants of Judah continued to call themselves Yehudi, meaning from Judah. No one knows exactly what happened to the Ark of the Covenant. Some believe Nebuchadnezzar took it to Babylon. Others say Israelite priests hid it under the ruins of Solomon's temple. Still, others say it was sent south to Abyssinia to be protected by the descendants of King Menelik. 50 years later, it was Babylon's turn to be invaded. Cyrus the Great, founder of the Achaemenid dynasty of Persia, was busy creating the world's largest empire, and Babylon was in the way. In 539 BCE, Cyrus captured Babylon and absorbed it within his vast empire. When Babylon fell, Cyrus freed the Judean captives, allowing them to return to their home in Judah. Though most of them did return, some chose to remain in Babylon. These would be the ancestors of today's Iraqi Jews. Together with the community in Egypt, they would mark the beginning of the Jewish diaspora. Over the next several decades, various Israelites worked to rebuild Solomon's temple. It was finally completed during the reign of Persia's greatest king, Darius I. 200 years after Cyrus's death, the Achaemenid Empire faced a new challenge. A young Macedonian king named Alexander waged an incessant and none-ending war against the Persians. Alexander the Great would conquer most of the Persian Empire, including the lands of Judah. Despite being a spectacular field commander in general, Alexander did not live a long life. When he died suddenly at the age of 32, his empire, which stretched from Greece to India, fell into civil war. When the dust settled, Judea was part of the Seleucid Empire, founded by one of Alexander's generals, Seleucus Nictor. 145 years later, in 167 BCE, the Seleucid government outlawed Israelite religious practices and ordered all Israelites to worship Greek idols. Though some Israelites complied with the new law, many others revolted. The Maccabean Revolt, as it came to be known, successfully created an independent Israelite state. The victorious Israelites wanted to cleanse and rededicate the temple, which had been defiled by pagan sacrifices. But they needed pure olive oil to do so, and there was only enough to last one day. Miraculously, the oil lasted 8 days, giving them time to prepare a fresh batch of kosher oil. This miracle is commemorated in the annual celebration of Hanukkah. Judas Maccabee, the leader of this revolt, became the ruler of Judea, and his family would begin the Hasmonean dynasty. This independent Jewish state lasted about a century before the Roman general Pompey the Great invaded and turned it into a client state. Pompey's rival, Julius Caesar, helped Judea briefly regain its independence. But then, as we know, Julius Caesar was assassinated, leading to chaos in the Roman government, and Judea fell into civil war. Finally, in 37 BCE, Mark Antony subdued Judea and installed the puppet king, Herod the Great. By 6 BCE, Judea had been fully absorbed into the Roman Empire. Years of sinful practices, divine punishment, and foreign domination had forced the descendants of Yaqub, that is, Bani Israel, also known as the Yehudi, to do some self-reflection. The Israelites began to divide into various religious sects. The Sadducees and Pharisees were two philosophical groups that bickered with each other constantly. These two groups couldn't agree on how the Torah should be understood. And then there were the Essenes, who lived an ascetic life of voluntary poverty. There were also the Zealots, who believed they had to throw off their pagan Roman overlords and establish an Israelite state based on the law of Moses. Some Israelites felt their current situation was a punishment from Allah for straying from the Mosaic law. As a result, they became very rigid and inflexible in their interpretation of that law. Other Israelites believed the world was coming to an end and Allah's final judgment was soon to come. It should come as no surprise that many religious teachers, preachers, and callers to truth appeared during this era. One of these teachers who stood out from the crowd was a man named Yeshua, or Joshua, from the tribe of Judah. Yeshua's message was radically different from the other self-proclaimed religious men running around Judea at the time. Yeshua preached a message of love and peace and rejected the rigid fundamentalism of the Jewish priests. And he attracted many Israelites with his apocalyptic warnings of divine judgment and punishment. But Yeshua also alienated many Israelites with his claim of being a prophet born from a miraculous birth. Ultimately, the fundamentalists and the radicals united against Yeshua, accusing him of claiming to be Allah's son and wanting to be king of the Jews. Yeshua was delivered to the Roman authorities, who found him guilty of sedition and sentenced him to death by crucifixion. At this point, the three monotheistic religions diverge as to what truly happened to Yeshua. Christians believe Yeshua was crucified and his death was the fulfillment of a promise from Allah to forgive mankind of its sins. Muslims believe Allah saved Yeshua from execution just like he saved Ibrahim alayhi salam centuries earlier. Jews don't believe Allah had anything to do with it at all and that Yeshua was just one of many holy men executed by the Romans. In the years following Yeshua's disappearance, the small sect of Israelites that followed his teachings struggled to survive the fundamentalist persecution. Several years after Yeshua's trial, one of these fundamentalists had a change of heart and joined the sect. He changed his name to Paul and began spreading his understanding of Yeshua's message beyond Judea. Paul also advocated preaching to non-Israelites, which was a radical idea at the time. Paul even made it to Rome, where he laid the groundwork for a church dedicated to the teachings of Yeshua the Anointed, or Jesus Christus in Latin. Paul taught that Jesus Christus was Allah's son and had died for man's sins. This idea attracted many pagans of the Roman Empire, where similar myths already existed. While Paul was preaching his new message throughout the Roman Empire, tensions were rising between Bani Israel and the Roman government back in Judea. Julius Caesar had established the Israelites as a special category of Roman subjects. They were free to practice their faith as they wished and were excused from worshiping deities from the Roman pantheon. They were even allowed a certain level of self-government. However, the Roman Empire began to exert more control over Judea. The Romans levied increasingly higher taxes and restricted Jewish religious liberties. In response, some of the more radical Hebrews began attacking and killing Roman citizens. The Romans responded with heavy punitive measures, further radicalizing Bani Israel. In 66 CE, Bani Israel revolted against Roman rule. It took several years, but Rome finally suppressed the rebellion in 73 CE. Like Nebuchadnezzar centuries earlier, the Romans showed no mercy. The Romans sacked the Second Temple and confiscated its treasures. The temple itself was destroyed, leaving only its western wall standing. Thousands of Israelites were killed or enslaved. 60 years later, another Israelite rebellion broke out. The Bar Kokhba revolt of 132 CE was different because it was not limited to Judea. Several Yehudi communities within the Roman Empire rose in rebellion. Shaken by how widespread the Bar Kokhba revolt was, the Roman crackdown was especially vindictive. They put thousands of Hebrews around the empire to death, nearly wiping out the entire Yehudi populace. As further punishment, the Romans banned the Yehudi from re-entering Jerusalem and renamed Judea to Syria Palestina. Unable to return to their ancestral home, many Yehudi resettled in different parts of the Roman Empire, which included most of Europe. Some Yehudi, however, moved deeper into the Arabian Peninsula and established communities amongst their Arab cousins. The Jews who moved to Europe usually settled in urban areas and, for the most part, did well for themselves. They must have been surprised by the alarming growth of that obscure Jewish sect that claimed to follow Yeshua of Nazareth. Though Paul had likely been beheaded by the Romans 70 years earlier, his practice of preaching to the Gentiles had been effective. Not limited to a single ethnic group, these disciples of Christ, as the sect called themselves now, were spreading throughout Europe. Outsiders called them Christians and often viewed them with mistrust. Like other Jews, these Christians sometimes faced persecution from their neighbors and the government. But that did not stop the growth of this new sect of Judaism. After a while, however, these Christians wanted to differentiate themselves from other Jews. As the community grew, its leaders clarified the tenets of their belief, slowly creating a new identity for themselves. The worship of Jesus Christus and the belief that he had died for their sins became primary tenets of the Christian faith. These Christians also gradually abandoned Jewish kosher laws, and their focus shifted away from Jerusalem and towards their church's headquarters in Rome. The Christian faith got a significant boost when Emperor Constantine converted in 312 CE. Constantine legalized Christianity and poured government resources into its growth and development. The tide had changed, and it was now better to be a Christian in the Roman Empire than not. 62 years later, Emperor Theodosius I made Christianity the official state religion of the Roman Empire. With this, the relationship between Christianity and Judaism changed. Those Jews who refused to convert to Christianity were persecuted, oppressed, and forced to live in segregated neighborhoods called ghettos. As the Roman Empire weakened and broke into various smaller states, it became easier and more acceptable to persecute the Jews. While the descendants of Isaac were building kingdoms and fighting empires, the descendants of his brother, Ismael, were heading in a much less dramatic direction. If you remember from earlier in our story, Allah directed Ibrahim alayhi salam to resettle his Egyptian wife, Hajar, and their son, Ismael, in Arabia. Ibrahim left Hajar and Ismael in the barren valley of Mecca with a few provisions which quickly ran out. According to Islamic tradition, when Ismael began crying from thirst and hunger, Hajar sought help or sustenance. While running between two small hills, Allah caused water to begin miraculously flowing over the hot sands. Naturally surprised and elated, Hajar tried to contain the water flow with her hands and repeated, "Zom, Zom," meaning stop flowing. But the water did not stop flowing. You can imagine her joy as Hajar tried to contain the water flow by building sand barriers with her bare hands. Hajar was now able to provide for herself and her baby Ismael. The water flowing from the ground caused little green sprouts to shoot out from the moist sands. The plants attracted insects and the insects attracted birds. Miles away, a small group of Bedouins noticed the birds flying over Hajar's little camp. The Bedouins were familiar with all the oases in the area and knew there wasn't one in that region. Curious, they investigated and met Hajar and little Ismael. Perhaps the Bedouins misunderstood Hajar when she shouted at the stubborn well to stop flowing. Whatever the case, they called the well Zamzam and asked permission to water their animals. Over time, more Bedouins would stop at this newfound oasis. Some would water their animals and move on, but others settled in Mecca. These newly settled Bedouins eventually took a liking to Hajar's son, Ismael, whom they took in as one of their own. They taught him their language and even let him marry their daughters when he grew older. They even listened when he encouraged them to worship Allah who had befriended his father. And though it wasn't often, sometimes Ibrahim traveled 700 miles from Canaan to visit his son when he could. They even took the time to construct a small temple together. This was the first building dedicated to worshiping Allah. This building was little more than 4 walls in a rough rectangular shape. It had no roof, no paint, and no covering. The only thing unique about the building was the smooth black stone in its corner which had fallen from the sky. Despite its plain appearance, the Bedouins loved this little temple. Those Bedouins who did not remain in Mecca would make it a point to visit at least once a year. Many even accepted the monotheistic faith of Ismael alayhi salam and followed him as a prophet of Allah. The ancestors of these Bedouins had originated from the Horn of Africa before crossing over to the southern tip of Arabia in today's Yemen. By the time of Hajar and Ismael, they had spread throughout Arabia, even establishing powerful kingdoms such as the Ad and the Thamud. The various nomadic tribes of Arabia spoke several different languages and dialects. But over time, the dialect of the northern Arab tribes, with its proximity to Syria, Judea, and Egypt, grew dominant. This form of Arabic took hold in Mecca, the city that grew from Hajar's camp. And while these northern Arabs did not care much for sculpture, painting, or other visual arts, they loved poetry. A culture of poetry developed around the language which permeated Arab society at all levels. Bedouins and townsfolk composed poetry glorifying their lineage, lamenting forsaken love, and honoring their warriors. But desert life was also difficult. Even the relatively cosmopolitan Arabs of Mecca could not escape the brutality of this life. Food was simple, water was scarce, and life was short. In such an environment, family and honor took precedence. The simplest disagreement could spark generations of violence between clans. And with the absence of larger empires and established legal structure, rule of law was almost non-existent. Slaves, foreigners, and women were at the mercy of men from powerful families. In Mecca, a form of oligarchy took shape where the male leaders of the various clans of the Quraysh tribe ran everything. By the time the Roman Empire became Christian, most Arabs had abandoned Ismael's monotheistic religion. Now, this is not to say the Arabs were ignorant of monotheism. Several Jews who had escaped the Roman purge had settled in Arabia and created their own communities. Also, many northern Arab tribes had accepted Christianity and Arabized the Latin name Isus to Isa. There were even a handful of Arabs who rejected paganism and practiced their own form of monotheism. And the pagan Arabs of this time continued to practice the Abrahamic tradition of circumcision. Nonetheless, by the middle of the 6th century CE, most Arabs were pagan. They had a pantheon of deities headlined by the goddesses known as Allat and Al-Uzza. Even the Kaaba, the temple that Ibrahim and Ismael alayhimussalam had built, was now filled with various pagan idols. In the first decade of the 7th century, Prophet Muhammad ﷺ began preaching Islam in Mecca. Islam stressed strict monotheism like Judaism, but was open to people of all backgrounds like Christianity. The Qurayshi oligarchy of Mecca violently opposed Prophet Muhammad's mission, stifling Islam's growth. After 13 years of preaching, he had less than 300 followers. But things changed when 2 warring clans from a small village called Yathrib accepted Prophet Muhammad's teachings. They made him their leader, hoping he could bring some stability to their homeland after decades of fighting. Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, did much more than that. Islam flourished in Yathrib, which was renamed Madinatun Nabi, or the City of the Prophet. This was the beginning of a new chapter of human history. Through a deft combination of warfare, politics, and preaching, Prophet Muhammad united the Arabs under the banner of Islam. Prophet Muhammad's followers, known as Muslims, would eventually capture Mecca and cleanse the Kaaba of the pagan idols. After the Prophet's death, ﷺ, his successors, known as caliphs continued Islam's expansion. Islam flowed out of Arabia across Persia, the Levant, and into Egypt. Even Jerusalem, the ancestral home of the Israelites, was absorbed into the growing Muslim empire. After the first four caliphs, a period of internal strife and civil war interrupted Islam's progress. Ultimately, the Umayyad clan of the Quraysh would establish Islam's first true dynasty. The Umayyad Caliphate would continue to grow, spreading across North Africa, across the Bering Strait, and into southern Iberia. To the east, Islam spread from Persia into Afghanistan and on into the Indian subcontinent. Islam continued to grow even after the Umayyads fell. And as Islam grew to encompass more people, Arab hegemony eroded. Powerful Islamic states in Persia, Africa, and Asia emerged without any Arab leadership. Nonetheless, the Quran and the Arabic language in which it was revealed remained at the center of Islamic life. Despite Islam's impressive growth, size, and resiliency, it was always beset with incessant factionalism. Since the days of the early caliphs, various Muslim groups have fought each other over the right to lead the Muslim world. By the dawn of the 10th century, the Muslim world was split between two caliphs and several states. In Baghdad, the Abbasid Caliphate, which had overthrown the Umayyads, held nominal rule over the Sunni branch of Islam. In Cairo, the Fatimids, who considered themselves the true caliphate, ruled over much of North Africa and the Levant. The Fatimids were a branch of the Ismailis, who were a branch of the Shiites who had split off from the Sunnis. The divisions in the Muslim world grew even worse when the mighty Seljuk Empire, which ruled over much of Persia and Central Asia, descended into civil war. During this chaos, an army of Christian warriors, mainly originating from what we now consider France, invaded the Muslim world. These Crusaders, as they came to be known, were intent on capturing Jerusalem for themselves. The Crusaders were successful, besieging and pillaging Jerusalem in 1099, killing thousands of Muslims and Jews in the process. Jerusalem was under Christian rule for the first time in over 400 years. Despite their success, the Christian kingdom of Jerusalem was short-lived, with a new Muslim hero on the rise. Salahuddin al-Ayyubi was a Kurdish ruler and general. Using shrewd politics and a devastating war machine, he united the various Muslim factions in the region under his rule. Then he drove the Crusaders out of Jerusalem, reclaiming the city for Islam in 1187. But less than 40 years later, Islam faced a new threat, this time from the Mongols in the east. The Mongols invaded the Muslim Khwarezmian Empire in 1220 and continued to expand across the Muslim world. In 1258, the Mongols besieged and violently sacked Baghdad, the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate. The Mamluks finally stopped the Mongols in 1260 at the Battle of Ain al-Jalut. Over the next several decades, many of the Mongols accepted Islam. Among the many people displaced by the Mongols were various Turkic groups. One of these groups were the Oghuz Turks, who eventually settled in Anatolia. The Oghuz were divided into several clans called beyliks. The Osmanlu beylik was the most successful and eventually grew into a powerful empire. This empire, known as the Ottoman Empire in English, covered all of Anatolia and much of Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. The Ottomans flourished for several hundred years, but began to decline in the 1700s. This decline coincided with the rise of Christian European empires and the age of exploration. 200 years later, the Ottoman Empire was gone, and these increasingly secular Christian European empires had colonized much of the Muslim world. There's more to the story, such as the rise of the United States, the modern Muslim nation-state, and of course, that genocidal monstrosity in the Middle East. But I think this is a good place to stop for now. So what do you think of the origins and growth of each of these so-called Abrahamic faiths? And more importantly, how do you think it will end? Islamic eschatology states there will be an apocalyptic war between Muslims, Christians, and Jews. Do you believe we're heading in that direction? Leave your thoughts and comments below, but as always, please, keep it respectful. If you'd like to know how Mecca and Medina became part of Saudi Arabia, then watch the video to the right. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.